Hello, everyone. Can you all hear me well? Hello.
Yes.
Perfect. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, and esteemed panelists, welcome to our town hall session. I am Edith Kimani. I'm also a journalist who happens to live and cover sub-Saharan Africa. And by doing so, I've witnessed firsthand the stark realities of climate change. I've also seen how international climate diplomacy can augment that reality for better or for worse. So in this session, Coping Mechanism, Prospects for International Climate Diplomacy, will explore critical questions surrounding the achievements of climate diplomacy, the preparations for COP29, and the innovative approaches needed to navigate geopolitical tensions and drive substantial progress towards global climate targets. So with that, it gives me immense pleasure to introduce our esteemed panelists today. This empty chair here represents Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister for Barbados. She's going to be joining us, I understand, about 10 minutes from now, but in absentia. Let's welcome her. I'd also like to invite Mr. Mukhtar Babayev. He is a Minister of Ecology and Natural Resources from the Republic of Azerbaijan, and of course, the President 2024 for COP29. Welcome.
Thank you.
We've also got Mr. Achim Steiner, an Administrator, United Nations Development Programme. Welcome.
Thank you.
And last but not least, Wopke Hoekstra, who is a Commissioner for Climate Action, European Commission. Thank you all for being here. So, you know, at the Africa Climate Summit and indeed at COP, there was a lot that was being said, urging countries to talk less and to have more action. And so, Mr. Steiner, I'd like to ask you, being a veteran diplomat, especially with matters environment, following the COP28 final global stocktake deal, are you more or less optimistic about advancing climate action globally?
Unreservedly more. And if you allow me, I'm also going to try and make a plea for people to appreciate how vital climate diplomacy has been over the last 30 years, or if you take the Conference of the Parties and the Climate Convention since 1992, because we often consider the COP failures. We often portray the convention as not being the vehicle in which the world can come together. And I just want to give you 3 examples of the opposite, of how climate diplomacy in many ways, first of all, depends on the constituents, i.e. in a convention you have member states, you have signatories, and what we often blame for is the vehicle rather than those who are driving it. So just to give you an example, in Sharm el-Sheikh, the world agreed that it would set up a loss and damage fund. Remarkably, it took less than 11 months at the Dubai COP to then actually enact that decision and to resource it also with $800 million. So to those who say nothing is ever possible, here is an example. When countries agree, the convention is not the problem. Let me go back to Copenhagen. Because it was a paradigmatic shift at that time. We had tried for many years to have the COP define a top-down way of, let's say, obliging countries to act on climate change. Clearly in Copenhagen, it was a meltdown. And in some ways, we flipped the paradigm on its head, because we then said, okay, if we can't do it top-down, then let's try if we can do it bottom-up. And so the nationally determined contributions emerged, which essentially is a voluntary expression of intent by countries, but by federating them through the convention, you begin to see a pattern of whether the world can address climate change. And here, very briefly, Paris, 2015, we were a world on a 3.5-degree pathway. Glasgow, a few years later, taking the NDCs now, these voluntary commitments by countries, raising their levels of ambition, we brought the world closer to a 2.5-degree scenario. I don't think it is inconceivable that in Brazil, by the time we have been to Azerbaijan, address the issue of financing, which is critical, we may be able to agree on a series of nationally determined pathways and commitments that could take us closer to 1.5 degrees. So climate diplomacy can work, sometimes does work, but it needs 2 things that are fundamental: public scrutiny. And people underestimate the power of this COP, forcing basically every leader every year to come around the table and be in the full limelight of the public, accountable for what they're doing or not doing. And we've spent many years, no denying of that, wasting time, blaming each other. And secondly, negotiating critical elements that enable countries to move forward together, even though they're responsibilities, their abilities to act are extremely different. And that's why financing remains the central variable that will allow climate diplomacy to ultimately succeed.
All right. So given what you said, what lessons then can we draw from this process, particularly coming out of COP28? And conversely, I think you've already touched on that. What areas require additional efforts or maybe even novel approaches?
Very briefly, I think we in part have moved into an age where climate change is no longer only defined by its threat, the narrative of, the world will end if we don't act, or at least it will not be what we know it to be today, into a world of opportunity. Energy transition today is as much about new markets, new forms of energy, maybe an age in which actually access to electricity and energy is no longer a matter of geopolitical conflicts or competition, but could be ubiquitous. So I think that has changed the perspective of many countries. And again, we talked about the climate summit in Nairobi, when President Ruto invited African leaders and the international community to say, look, it is in Africa's interest to figure out a pathway forward, but we need partnerships. And that's where I think we need to also look at a different way of not just looking at the economics. The economics of transitioning to low carbon technologies is beyond doubt now. The problem is if you don't have the money, if you're in a indebted economy, you're not able to invest in this transition. And that's why we need to find a different way to talk about financing, co-investing in the ability to move forward. And unless we can reframe that narrative, we are still going to be haggling by basically one group saying, we're not going to act if you don't give us money, and the other group saying, why should we give you money if you're not acting? We've spent many years in that game.
Yeah, so to stop that cycle, as it were, Minister Babayev, what steps do you think need to be taken, especially by you as the incoming COP presidency in the run-up to COP29 to accelerate implementation and to stop some of these cycles?
Thank you. All Mr. Steiner mentioned are very important, that we need to continue the process started on previous COPs, and I think there is a very good chance to transform to the action already decided issues on COP27 and COP28, and I think the consensus made in Dubai last year give us a good framework and good chance to move all the agenda forward. And I think for Azerbaijan is also a very good chance to be the interconnector or bridge between the global south and global north regarding the financial, the climate finance issues. And I think we will mobilize all the efforts to do our best in the frame of this work. At the same time, we would like to provide the maximum inclusivity to the process, to invite as much as possible all participants, all stakeholders to the process, and I mean the international financial institutes, private sector is very important to invite as much as possible. NGOs, society. Yesterday we talked a lot with Madame Jennifer Morgan regarding the NGOs' involvement in this process. I think it is a very good chance to do it within this year, and I think it will be a very good chance to prepare also good outcomes from the 2025 COP in Brazil.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And so still looking ahead, Commissioner Hoekstra, Minister Babayev has just alluded to that, this idea of inclusivity, but after all the declarations and commitments made at COP28, what concrete, actionable steps should organizations, sub-state or non-state organizations take to ensure that these are not just consensus points, that they're actually drivers of real progress?
Well, actually, it's always better on a panel when the panelists are in violent disagreement, right? Because then you have a bit of a conversation. But I tend to agree that the COP, or the previous COP, was a huge success, and it was a victory of diplomacy. And actually, if you look at what was agreed at the COP, those concrete points on transitioning away of fossil, tripling renewable, doubling energy efficiency is very concrete and have had already immediate effects in the real world. Just to give you one example, Netherlands, the country I know best, within a week there was a declaration by one of the large banks to shift course, given what it was agreed on at the COP. So I'm fully with everyone who is saying, well, there is the declaration, and that does not have the same legal status as a law, and you need to put it into practice. And clearly we need the scrutiny of the public and of the media to make sure that companies, non-government organizations, and certainly states live up to this obligation. Having said that, why is there so much fight? Why is the fight so huge about a declaration? Because all countries gathered together do know that the power of such a declaration is enormous. And indeed, as you said, you will be back in a year, you will be held to account, and that is why there goes so much energy in this declaration. So we do need to deliver, but the COP was a huge step forward in making it concrete. And all the conversations I've had with not only the NGOs, but also particularly the business community is how we make this tangible, how we make this concrete, how we can make this into, as you said, an opportunity. So the driving force behind these COPs is, I feel, tremendous.
Okay, so tangible, yes, but how about more efficient? Considering the pace of these negotiations, you've just told me why it's really important to make sure that this declaration is done right. But, given the current framework of international climate diplomacy, do you think it's still fit for purpose? The winds of change always start slowly, and I'm fully with all who say, our direction of travel is the right one, but we need to move faster. That unfortunately truly is the reality. Our scientific community is telling us that the planet has only red lines left, and had we started 30, 40, 50 years earlier, we would not be in the state where we currently are. Having said that, the thing that is so important is to make this concrete at a country level, become more ambitious by every COP, and then make sure that this trickles down into our societies. Let me just give you the example of Europe. We have a very concrete goal for 2030, which is 55%. Our best guess now is that we will outperform that, we will reach 57 by 2030. We clearly, at the far end, we have the zero for 2050, and the first communication of the Commission has been that with a whole set of conditionalities, we aim to arrive at 90% in 2040. Continuing with Europe's leadership role at home, and by the way, also abroad, given that we will over-invest in the years to come in international climate diplomacy for one simple reason. If you look at the numbers, 7% of total emissions take place in Europe. Does that mean that we should not play a leadership role? No, we should absolutely continue to play a leadership role and drive down emissions back home. Having said that, climate change is indiscriminate. So if we do not solve the other 93%, we still all get wet feet. So a lot of our effort will be geared also towards the international stage in the years going forward, at least to the extent that I could influence it. Okay, so Minister Babayev, I have to ask then, because we're talking about transforming systems in their totality, and there are debates surrounding this transformation of energy systems particularly. So how do we ensure that the shift that we're talking about here towards renewable energy is not just about overlaying fossil systems, but completely replacing them?
Interesting question. The process, I think, to accelerated already the green energy or alternative energy involvement to the energy systems of the countries. And I think the process already will move more fast, and we have very good chance to accelerate it. The countries, if we take the Azerbaijan, our emissions is only 0.1%, but Azerbaijan started to invest quite intensively to the green energy projects, and today we are not only the country that started to increase our green energy facilities, but also to create the new corridors to export our green energy to other countries. And we signed the agreement already with EU regarding the green energy export from Azerbaijan, from the region, and we invite for this purpose also Georgia, Romania, Hungary, and I think it will be very good example how the countries or regions will unite it in the frame of the green energy. Regarding the replacement, I'm not so ready to say something now, but I think the process will move, and all of us, all of the stakeholders, needs to make the contribution to this process. And I think if we will mobilize all the efforts to this direction, we will have the success. Thank you.
All right, and this is a perfect opportunity to invite Prime Minister Mia Mottley, who has joined us. A round of applause for her.
Hey, good to see you again.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Thank you for joining us.
I wanted to do so a little while, but mobility in here is a little difficult.
Better late than never, and we've been told that we have a bit 10 minutes extra courtesy of you, so thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
So perhaps just to bring you up to speed, we were talking about the successes of COP28, looking ahead to Baku, but as you settle in, you can give us an impression of what you think of the outcome of COP28. Was it a success, in your opinion?
I think we made progress. The question always is it sufficient?
Try again? Yeah, you just need to hold it closer.
Thank you. As I said, I think we made progress. The question is whether we've made sufficient progress and whether we have enough time to make the progress that we need to make. I think the best news that I've had is the establishment of the Troika, which will have the former head, the current chair, and the future chair working together so as to ensure that there is continuity and that there's the capacity to keep momentum going. Having said that, I'm deeply disturbed that some of the clear, granular issues that are necessary to secure progress and victory are not necessarily being focused on because we're still fighting some of the big ticket issues as to the source of funding, as to the location of mechanisms, and I mean specifically having an appropriate mechanism for governance. And what do I mean by that? An annual conference of parties made sense when the crisis was 20, 30 years ahead. But when we are now in the midst of the crisis, and when the evidence has shown that we have hit 1.5 on too many days in the last year, I believe that the process for decision-making and engagement needs to change completely. And to that extent, having the Troika is a good first step, but we probably need to be having 2-3 times a year where we can have the decision-making framework to be able to secure progress.
So I'll repeat a question that I had asked Commissioner Hoekstra here about the pace of negotiations which you're alluding to. How do we then improve the efficiency and effectiveness of these negotiations? It could just be that 3 meetings is 3 times the stress and 3 times slower.
You're going to have the stress anyhow. So make up your mind that that's there. And that's there more so because of the geopolitics and the domestic politics of where things are for countries. But I do feel that if you don't have the ability to try at least 3 times a year and to try to make progress, however small, and claim it and move it, you're going to be missing targets on an annual basis, and then your capacity to recover from that missed target is less and less there. So that I really feel that at this stage, if the situation is as dire as we agree, then we need to find a global institutional mechanism that allows us to make progress at the sufficient pace and with the sufficient scale so as to make a real difference. Why? The populations of the world are not sitting back and just accepting that we're doing our best. They're watching. And if we say that it is the crisis that it is, and we're not prepared to make progress to save planet and people, then people are going to be disenchanted even more than they are today. And then the democratic institutions on which we hope societies can be kept together will be put under strain and stress. We already see it with respect to the extent to which climate migration adds to the instability, not just from the country from which people are leaving, but the countries to which they are trying to come to. And I somehow feel that we're having all of these conversations, but the issue is no longer about conversations, the issue is about action. And if you don't have an institutional capacity for action that is equal to the moment, then you are literally setting yourself up for failure and setting yourself up for greater apathy at best and cynicism at worst in the global population.
Wow. Okay. At this point, I'd like to invite Mads Christensen. He's the Executive Director, Greenpeace International. And I'm doing this now because he's got a view similar to yours about measuring success of international climate diplomacy. Mr. Christensen, please.
Thank you very much. This works. Thank you for the panel for acknowledging that the ultimate success of COP28 is a lot less about what was written and what was agreed, and rather about the action that is actually coming out of it. The breakthrough developments that we've seen within solar, wind, technologies, etc., now provides us a situation where we can actually build energy security without fossil fuels. That's amazing, but it's not happening fast enough, that's clear. Fossil fuel developments continue to happen at a pace that is unsustainable. The absence of financial support continues to put communities in the front lines at risk, those communities that have had least to do with the crisis that we're in. There's two absolute imperatives that we need to get on track. One is the national energy plans that we need to ensure are aligned with 1.5 degrees. After 30 years, it took to get end of fossil fuels into the wording. That is in itself good, not a moment too soon, but we are still seeing fossil fuel developments all over the world happening. We are on track now for more than double the production in 2030 than is aligned with 1.5 degrees. We need to see, especially those parts of the world where we have the biggest part of the historic responsibility for the crisis, including the EU, to provide plans for that phase out now. The second issue is the financing that you've talked a lot about already. And I think it's obvious that in the context we're in here in Munich, where we see public financing going into increased military spending to the tune of perhaps soon $3 trillion, that public financing is a real problem. Prime Minister Motley, you've talked many times about the need to make polluters pay. In Greenpeace, we couldn't agree more with that. So I think my question to the rest of the panel is, in order to find this financing that is so much needed, also beyond public financing, beyond the partnerships, the investments, are you also willing to actually go to those who have been most responsible for the crisis we're in, the corporates that are raking in profits in the trillions? Are we actually willing to go to them and find mechanisms to make them pay?
Thank you very much. I'll give you a chance to respond to that, Prime Minister, because the Bridgetown Initiative obviously poses some of these questions. And in asking these questions in the rooms that you sit in, what are the responses you're getting?
Well, we're evolving, and we've started to in all that we've been talking about. My deepest fear is that I don't want this to become just an issue of climate financing. The truth is that the world needs financing for global public goods, of which climate is perhaps the one that will suck most of the oxygen. But there's no less a compelling need for pandemics, fragility of war and conflict, food and water security as a special subspecies of climate, because we just simply need it to live, and the unregulated area of AI and digital divide. So I would say that up front, because we're at risk of people saying, well, you got what you want and you got what you've been arguing for, so keep quiet now. Regrettably, while we've got some progress and we're going in the right direction, we're nowhere near at the destination that we need to be. And I say so because to secure global public goods, we're going to need to admit that the nation state alone funding will not be enough, and that we have allowed in the last century the evolution of such large entities to emerge and such inequity to take place with respect to the distribution of wealth, that you have players whose balance sheets dwarf 2/3 of the world's states. So you can't ignore them from the conversation. In this particular case, we use the example of those who pollute. We say, okay, you've contributed in the fossil fuel industry. You say that you want to innovate and to decarbonize. We get it. And that will require research money. But as you do that, of the 4 trillion in profits that you made, pretend that 95% is 100% and leave 200 billion on the table on an annual basis, 5% of your profits on an annual basis to be able to help fund the global public good of being able to deal with adaptation. The danger is that people feel that also, because loss and damage has become so sexy in the eyes of the media, all the oxygen in the room went to that. You're not even at $1 billion for loss and damage yet. And that amount, even if you were at $1 billion, would be immediately taken up with 1 or 2 disasters this year, far less anything else. So you can't take your eyes off adaptation. You can't ask countries that don't have fiscal space and you have debt issues that are so destabilizing that even if you gave them money to deal with adaptation, they can't take it because of the other rules that you have in the system. So we're saying, look, broaden the discussion. Get sufficient money on an annual basis from the entities polluted or the entities who stand to make an egregious profit as well. Because if you're going to make an egregious profit from the climate, you need to leave something on the table as well. In shipping, the shipping industry, the value is about 7 trillion a year. Leave 1% on the table. That's 70 billion every year and growing. So we can find mechanisms to do it. And then we have philanthropy still, where people have the right to spend their money how they want, but perhaps need to leave 5 cents in the dollar on the table for what the world needs and not just what they want. If we can do that and change the whole model for public funding of global public goods in the international community, then we will get the greatest progress to be able to fund climate. And we can start to be able to have sensible discussions. I do have a caution. It is okay to say remove the subsidies for the fossil fuel at the domestic level. But when you do that, who gets hurt the most? Invariably the poorest. So that you can't have a discussion that is very vanilla type or linear. It is a complex discussion. And that's why I'm saying that you can't meet once a year. You need to be meeting at least 2-3 times a year to begin to unpack a lot of these issues. And when we finish the financing, how are we going to deal with the procurement issues? Small countries like mine are being told, of course, that you're too small to be able to attract the attention of the market. You can't influence pricing. And at the end of the day, what's the sense of giving me funding if I can't build out the project? Funding is not the destination. Funding is just the oxygen to get to the destination. So there's some other real difficult issues that have to be put in place, and that's why I go back to the governance mechanism as being the most important mechanism to resolve in order to unpack the progress at scale and at speed that we need.
Jennifer Morgan, I'd like to invite you to make your remarks now. Last year at this time, you were sat right here with me on this stage. And basically the conclusion was it's a marathon, not a sprint. I wonder if that perspective has changed.
Well, I think it's both. I mean, it is a sprint because we know we have little time to have global emissions by 2030, and we know that we're off track. And so the speed and the scale of the change is the most thing, I think, that that has to be the driving force right now. Because yes, we are in a good direction. Yes, the clean energy things are moving, but we're not on track of where we need to be. So from that perspective, we're in a sprint. And I think the credibility of the Dubai outcome, which I think was both historic from the fact that we finally are talking about the real economy and fossil fuels, but far from being adequate from dealing with the problem as a whole. So we have to move quickly. We know that piece. But the marathon, It is about the system that we are creating, you know? And so the question that's in my head and why I think this is such an important discussion is, what can we get done this year? What must we get done next year? And continuing, because we know on the one hand, the multilateral system is very troubled right now. On the other hand, we managed in Dubai to bring everybody together to get an outcome that was not bad. So what do we use that for this year? And I think, Prime Minister, your leadership on this and thinking across the board, we will need, I mean, in Germany, we are looking at all of these options, right? What is the option that is going to leverage the private finance, that's going to be the new source? Is it the maritime? Is it a tax on private jets and business class? Is it the windfall profits from oil, which was actually in a European conclusion in October? Let's dig into that. I don't think we can do that. That's where the marathon comes in. I feel the sprint to get a couple of things. We need some wins so we can show we can do this together. The World Bank reform, all of the debt and the fiscal space, I think now there's a space for it. But we need to get concrete. We need to know where the decisions are going to be made. Are they going to be made in, and then I think the challenge for Minister and incoming COP president is that so many of the decisions that need to be made in order to get that decision at the COP to be a successful one are outside of the COP. And that's the other governance issue.
Yeah, and let me just throw that question back to Minister Babayev, because as Secretary Morgan has clearly said, these decisions are being made currently in the face of mounting geopolitical tension. So how do we ensure that climate action remains a priority?
For the COP29 president's team, Munich Security Council is a very good chance at least to hear all the ideas and priorities by different groups of countries. The last week we visited United Arab Emirates to talk with other group of the countries. The next week we are planning to visit Nairobi, Kenya, and to hear again, to participate in different discussions regarding what kind of initiatives coming from the Africa. From African countries, from other countries of the region. At the same time, we are now in the listening process. We'd like to, as much as possible, to absorb different initiatives, different ideas from the whole group of the countries. At the same time, I think it will be a very good chance also to make the leadership for this process and to have the good decisions in Baku. But for this purpose, we need the support of all of the stakeholders. I think that all of the countries needs to make their contribution to this process.
Yeah, and indeed the stakeholders are many, Mr. Steiner. And I'm wondering what collaborations can be leveraged to accelerate climate action, to keep the momentum going, particularly in areas where traditional diplomatic efforts have been slow.
Just to pick up on this notion, is diplomacy enabling or is it obstructive? And before you came, Prime Minister, I was talking up a little bit the platform of the COP, and I agree with you. I think it has to evolve because we are in a different period. The question is there enough shared interest and is there enough perspective? And I again want to go back a little bit to these nationally determined contributions, because they are a conversation amongst the citizens and the economic players and the elected officials of a country on what is, in our reading of the situation, a viable way to move forward. I think there are a few countries left now that would argue that climate change is not an imminent threat or already a very real threat. So the question is more, can you define pathways forward and then also put, in a sense, the financing equation underneath them? And that's partly what NDCs will enable us to do by the time we get to COP30, which is to say we could move. And that's why I don't want to in any way minimize the risk that the world is not on track. We all agree. To your point, Jennifer's point also, we are not on track, but we are capable of getting back on track. So I think right now what we need to forge is, first of all, a confidence in one another. And we are in a different place. 10 years ago, in Europe and the US, the debate was, why should we do anything because China and India will not move? Well, China and India are moving. Then many in the developing world said, yes, but you know, the traditional polluters are not moving. We just heard Europe is now committed to a 90% decarbonization by 2040, I think you said. This was also not on the card. So there is reasons to actually build confidence in everyone raising their level of ambition. And then we come to the partnerships, whether it is in the financing domain, whether it's in technology, whether it's in new financing models also. We need to get a key part of our economy in the world, which is the financial sector and the technology sector, to take equity in places in the world where at the moment they simply do not show interest. And this is the great tragedy of this moment. We have countries in the global south and the developing world that are already today producing more than 80–90% of their electricity with renewables. Now, how on earth did that happen? Partly because they had leadership, partly because they had partnership, partly because they also needed to act in terms of access to affordable electricity. And I think it's when you weave those ingredients together, we do have a pathway ahead of us, but it needs to be based on a sense of shared purpose and shared interest, rather than having these COPs still being treated as a chessboard where you're basically trying to outplay each other. This has been one of the real problems of COP negotiations. So diplomacy can also stumble over its own strategy.
All right, I'd like to hear from the floor, please. Members of, oh, wow, I love the enthusiasm. We'll start with Nazreen there, and the two questions at the back. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Nasina Saim. I was the chair of the UN Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change, also negotiated with the African Group of Negotiators, a physicist, and 12 years climate activist right now. So I've tried it all, the diplomacy, the UN somehow, but also the activism and the science. And the conclusion that I got after 12 years of activism, and 10 COPs, my last COP was my 10th, is that we need to be honest ourselves, first of all, in order to be able to move forward. Thank you, Prime Minister Mia. You pointed a lot of points that speak to people who are coming from a country like mine, for example, Sudan. Mr. Hakim, I'm not sure which world are you talking about, but this is not my world. Maybe it's another country's world, but not mine. NDCs. Now it's 10 years since the NDCs was brought to the table at the first place, and until now only 4% of the NDCs were actually not even met but started working on. So if after 10 years only 4% started acting on, not even committed or fulfilled, so why are we still trying it? We're obviously not working. Partially because NDCs itself was a universal trial, a universal experiment that most of us failed on. US have to submit 7 times as much as the NDCs are submitted. Germany have to submit 3 times NDCs as they submitted. Russia didn't submit any NDCs, for example. And the list goes very long. In Glasgow, Prime Minister Modi, yes, he committed India to go carbon neutral by 2070, and I asked him one question because I was giving a speech with him, and I said, will you be there in 2070? He said, likely not. It's like, why do you keep giving promises for times that you will not be there? What about today? What about next year? What about your presidential time? Okay. And this question is going for all, but my last point is from what Mia mentioned, that Prime Minister Mia, that we need a new model that the leadership is going to the people who are actually going to deal with the circumstances of climate change. For people who don't have not only voice, but will not be able to reach finance, even if it's there, maybe because of debt, maybe because of war, maybe because of whatever. Let's take example Sudan, which is my country. We have 10
Please wrap it up.
Yes, 10 months of war right now. And imagine if tomorrow we had a flood and it destroyed everything, let's say. Who's going to give the loss and damage money to a country who's in conflict and doesn't have government in the first place?
All right, Nazreen, thank you very much for your insights and your questions. I think, Mr. Schreiner, you should take this one. Why insist on a system which, according to Nazreen, is broken or not working?
We are trying to build a system, so I would not at all contest with Nazreen. I think both frustration and impatience, and I think they're both justified. I don't want to now go into the figures. I don't quite subscribe to the figures, Nazreen, that you took just now, but we are trying to construct something that allows the world to gain confidence in one another, and move forward with ambition with one another. And here, let us actually recognize again, the world is not going backwards on climate change. It's just not moving forwards fast enough. That's our problem. And in that sense, look, it would be much easier. Why don't we have a carbon tax? I mean, every economist tells us, you know, we could have had a carbon tax 20 years ago, financed all the energy transitions. All small island developing states would by now be 100% renewable, because we have real problems in our societies. We have real dilemmas and conflicts over the simplest of things. Why wouldn't we have a carbon tax on business class tickets or on shipping? Because climate change is embedded in larger debates about what to do. My point is simply, we cannot spend all our time trying to blame the other for not acting ourselves. The NDCs gave us a vehicle to allow each country to speak for itself in terms of its own interests. The question now is, can we create around that a governance system, a financing system, and a set of partnerships that are not going back to this aid model of the past? That's not going to solve our problem. We need to find a way in which we are co-investors who can enable a different kind of energy economy to emerge, and also not to fall into the trap of a G20 economy being a kind of shortcut to progress, because maybe on mitigation, people are tempted to say, well, if you could cut, you know, just the emissions of the G20, you would solve maybe 70, 80% of the problem. We are not a G20 world. Adaptation, Prime Minister Motley spoke to it, is not a G20 problem. It's the G173 other countries' problem.
Yeah.
Vulnerable countries. I want to pick up, because if I may call you Jennifer, I think Jennifer hit the nail on the head. We're asking for progress without having the appropriate institutions at the table to make the decisions at the same time. And you reinforced it, that the real issue is, until countries can get access to finance, until countries can get access to procurement, they're not in a position to make the promises real. At the same time, you can't just say, well, let's just have a removal of all subsidies, because poor people are the ones on the front line who are going to literally be affected the worst. What bothers me is that when heads of government and heads of state meet, their prime ministers, their ministers of finance, their ministers of environment are not ministers of environment on Mars. They're not ministers of finance on Mars. They're ministers of finance and environment in the same government that the head of government or the head of state is in. And therefore, the disconnect between the decisions at the World Bank or at the IMF and then at UNFCCC and then at the UN, you begin to say, well, this is playing into the hands of those conspiracy theorists or those who are anti-establishment, who believe that there is distrust in the political voice. And if you can't speak with one voice and act in one single purpose at this point in time when the planet is at risk of existence and people are at risk of becoming a species that will not exist, then when will you do it? And I really feel that the one thing, look, 4 or 5 years ago we said it continuously and we say it again, the world needs global, moral, strategic leadership. And I come here on the 60th anniversary of this town hall to say that it has never needed it more. And if you don't have heads of state and heads of government who are prepared to hold their ministers of finance and their ministers of environment to the same line that we need them to hold at the global level, then we are reducing our chances of being successful in this world.
Okay. The two questions at the back, please.
Thank you. My name is Bashar Al-Halabi, and I'm from Argus Media, an energy and climate reporter. India this week called for a floor of $1 trillion per annum for the new collective quantified goal, possibly the first country to put a specific number on it. What is your reaction to that? I ask everyone on the panel. And is it realistically achievable, especially from developed countries that already failed to meet the previous one?
Would you like to take that, Commissioner Hoekstra?
Yeah, so without knowing the exact nature of the comment, I think and the number, I think the one thing I would very much agree with, and I think everyone here on the panel, is that if you look at the tremendous task that we have ahead of us, of indeed walking faster, it is a marathon at high speed. Much more financing is needed, and the way I look upon it is actually that you need more in 3 different components. The first one is, it's very sensitive and difficult, but still it is very much needed, is on the side of public money, public financing. You know, we now have the 100 billion, the European Union is doing roughly 30. I think there is more needed from everyone, and we there do need to take into account, this is a sensitive discussion, but we do need to take into account that we need to move beyond the old paradigm of the developed and the developing world, and need to look at who has the ability to contribute to this, and who has had a fantastic ride in the last 20, 30 years, by the way, including the Europeans, who need to take responsibility there. So I think that is one. The second one, and that is where I very much agree with Mats and the Prime Minister, polluter pays. And that is why I've been so explicit about why I think we need something like a kerosene tax, because it would free up tremendous resources. It is the polluter paying, and how you exactly structure that, and whether that will be mostly geared towards private jets and business class, or towards, you know, all aviation, or you exempt, for example, small islands who are very much dependent on it. That is all, you know, on the how, but not on the why and on the what. So that is the second thing we need. The third thing we need is to free up much more private sector money. And that will probably mean that governments, like the ones in Europe, provide a green premium, because it is not always that attractive for the private sector to invest, but we do need that money, because my first and my second pillar in itself will not be enough to cover the whole endeavor. So you need to free up much more private sector money, and knowing the business community a bit, there needs to be an incentive to move there. And if you would add that all up, then I'm pretty sure you are at a very, very, very high number, even without knowing the exact details of the quote you just gave, sir.
Thank you. And final question.
Thanks a lot. My name is Kay. I'm from Transparency International, the vice chair. So it's very interesting going around the conversation, listening to you speaking about finance. It's very important for tackling climate change. But here is a warning that I urge you to consider. There is now a lot of financial flows around climate change, and not enough governance framework around it in weak countries, in poor countries like mine, Madagascar, which is one of the most vulnerable to climate change. So before draining millions of dollars to those countries upon the request of governments, please make sure that they have the capacity of, managing this, because otherwise there are high risks of corruption within the climate change sector. We have conducted some studies about that and research. You can see them online. So there is a huge risk here for these funds to be diverted. And second comment, I have no questions, but just comments.
Sure.
Commissioner, as you will be welcoming the COP29 in Azerbaijan, we've heard stories about arrests of human rights defenders and climate change activists and others. We do hope that in the upcoming COP, there will be a pacification of such issues, because you need to listen to all voices. Climate change is a global issue, and everybody should and can contribute to this. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your comments. So as we wrap up this discussion, I'd like to give each and every one of you a chance to give a final comment. We were told by the ambassador to come up with a silver lining, so homework is on you now. I believe it's only fair to start with you, Minister Babayev.
Thank you. First of all, COP29 in Baku will be the COP of transparency and inclusivity. We would like to invite all of the countries, all of the participants, to come to Baku and to participate in this fantastic event. We think that we can find good conclusions there. And at the same time, I think it is also a very good chance to take this success consensus made in Dubai, to bring it to Baku, and at the same time to deliver it to 2025 in Brazil. I think it will be a process within the Troika, and I think this collaboration between the three countries will give us very good chance not to be alone, but be together and to move this process, climate agenda, forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to leave you with the point on the necessity of speed and speeding up. I had a very early midlife crisis, so I did a marathon when I was 19. But I do want to stay with...
Excuse me, Commissioner Hoekstra, I have to find out, what is an early midlife crisis?
Well, I was doing a marathon when I was 19. And I typically tend to think that middle-aged men, start doing the marathon to keep up what they thought they once were.
In Europe.
But forget about this. It's... but it's the analogy, I think, that is very sticky. It is not just a sprint. It is not a marathon. It is a marathon at high speed. Our direction of travel is the right one, but we need to increase our speed. That is what we need to do. And the difficult thing is we need to do it all together, because if we have too many free riders, all of us will be too late at the destination. That is the thing.
Thank you.
Sorry, Jennifer, for the analogy.
Let me just say, as the United Nations Development Programme, much of our work is to learn lessons, and we've learned some bitter lessons on, sometimes abuse of systems, of our inability to perhaps have built the capacity that allows a country to fully take advantage also. Some of the international financing mechanisms we have built aren't exactly the straight track to co-financing. But much of what we would like to do is to help countries with the capacity that they need, and also to mobilize a national process. That's why we have made a climate promise again, leading up over the next 2 years to work with over 100 countries, maybe even 120, to help them in going through a public consultation process where civil society, but also business, investors, can actually look at what level of ambition are we comfortable with, and secondly, to help build the institutions and then the markets. So in Africa right now, we have a program that's called Africa Mini-Grids Program. It's trying to develop a platform for 21 African countries to look at mini-grid, off-grid technology. If that were to move forward, if the capacities are in place, the regulatory frameworks, the investors are able to come, it could bring access to affordable and clean energy for maybe 250 million people. This is an order of magnitude that changes lives for everyone. And that's the sort of world that I try to move in, with all the contradictions and setbacks we have. But making mistakes, sometimes getting it wrong, should never be a reason not to try. And that's why I think we need to be scrutinizing where countries sometimes maybe make decisions that a few years later are overtaken by circumstances. And this agility in being able to work together is critical. And I think to those who are investors and financiers, they need to also accept that that risk is not illegitimate. It's actually a risk that they take every day in other contexts when they make investments. And we judge them sometimes between North and South. And let's be honest, some of the abuse of climate finance happen as much in, let's say, OECD country context as it has happened in developing country context. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Finally, Prime Minister.
The silver lining, that we do not yet have a plan as to how we can live on the planet Mars. And as long as we don't have that, it means that we have to fight to be able to save life and to save planet. I believe that the capacity is there. The fact that we're going in the right direction is an acknowledgement of that, but the speed and the scope is what needs adjustment. With respect to the governance mechanisms, they're going to be difficult because they have to be new, but difficult is not impossible. Yep. And that is why leadership matters more than anything else, because the absence of scale and speed is a function of man-made decisions and man-made will. So, listen more, speed it up, collaborate and learn from each other's mistakes, and come to terms with the fact that we don't have Mars. So thank you so much to my panelists for such an interesting session, and to all of you, the audience. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.